I thought I had the perfect life, a loving wife, a beautiful family, and everything I'd ever worked for. But one shocking revelation shattered it all, leaving me to uncover the truth hidden behind years of lies. It had been an incredibly eventful 5 days, with countless miles logged on the wheels of our trusty minivan. Now, barely 20 minutes after arriving home, I found myself unwinding on the veranda. Settled into my favorite old chair with a glass of rich, dark porter in hand, my thoughts turned to our twins and how they were beginning their first real taste of independence, free from our watchful care. Miranda and I had just completed a journey that symbolized a major milestone in our lives, turning our once busy family home into an empty nest. It was the same path walked by countless other parents before us, but in that quiet moment, I was certain none could feel as content as I did right then. Our journey began with a trip to Atlanta, where Luke was starting his college life at Georgia Tech. Dropping him off there also meant the convenience of returning our rental car, sparing us the need to share long driving shifts. The next day, we accompanied our daughter Kelly to Gainesville, where she was set to join the Gators at the University of Florida. Afterward, Miranda and I drove a little further east to Daytona Beach, eager to enjoy a few days of sunshine and relaxation by the ocean. Those 3 days in Daytona were filled with moments we hadn't shared since before becoming parents, rekindling a passion we'd buried under the responsibilities of raising children. Miranda's enthusiasm was boundless, and for the first time in years, we allowed ourselves to let loose completely. Having kids when we were both just 18 meant that at 36, we still had the energy to live in the moment. Even on the way home, Miranda surprised me. At a deserted truck stop, she revealed with a mischievous grin that she had forgotten to wear her underwear for a reason. It was one of those moments that reminded me just how playful and vibrant she could be, even after all these years together. Now back home, I was soaking in the pleasant memories while Miranda headed upstairs to take a shower. A little while later, I was surprised to hear the hum of the hairdryer. It wasn't a sound I usually associated with her unless she was preparing for work or heading out somewhere special. Moments after the hairdryer went silent, I found myself wondering what was on her mind. I heard the familiar rhythm of Miranda's steps approaching, but what struck me was the clicking of her heels on the kitchen floor, a sound that seemed entirely out of place. Miranda typically moved around the house in her comfortable rubber-soled slippers or even barefoot. The unfamiliar noise piqued my curiosity, but before I could dwell on it, her voice interrupted my thoughts. "Alan, honey, could you come and sit with me for a minute? I need to talk to you, it won't take long," she called out from the kitchen. Startled from my quiet musings, I grabbed my empty glass, responding cheerfully as I stood. "I'm on my way, darling." Walking into the kitchen, I was taken aback. Miranda was seated at the table, looking remarkably composed in a fresh blouse and a pair of clean, perfectly fitting jeans. She looked as stunning as ever, but something about her demeanor felt different. In front of her was a steaming pot of freshly brewed coffee. She poured me a mug and set it down on the table, motioning for me to sit across from her. Her expression was focused, even tense, and I couldn't help but feel puzzled as I settled into the chair. "What's going on, Mary?" I asked warmly, wrapping my hands around the mug for comfort and taking a sip of the strong, hot brew. She looked me straight in the eyes, her voice unnervingly calm as she delivered her words. "I'm leaving you, Alan." My grip tightened instinctively on the mug, my mind racing to make sense of what I'd just heard. Before I could even process the shock, she picked up a thick envelope from the table. "These are the divorce papers," she continued in the same measured tone. "Everything's outlined clearly for you to review and sign." The rest of her words blurred into a haze as my world tilted. My chest tightened, and my thoughts scattered like debris in a storm. It felt as though I'd taken a knockout punch in a fight I didn't even know I was in, a sudden, brutal uppercut leaving me reeling. My hands trembled, and my ears buzzed with white noise. This was a blow I hadn't seen coming. With a slow, deliberate motion, Miranda slid the envelope across the table toward me. She carried on speaking, her words mechanical, each one landing like a hammer blow against my fractured composure. All the terms are written here. I'm not asking for anything. I've left all my belongings here for you to do with as you please. Our savings are already divided, the bills are paid through today, and I've cancelled all our joint credit cards. I stared blankly at the envelope in front of me, her voice continuing as if from a distant void. My mind struggled to keep up, trapped in a fog of disbelief. This was my wife, my Miranda. How had we gotten to this moment, and why had I not seen it coming? I've already notified everyone who needs to know about my change of address, Miranda stated firmly, her tone devoid of emotion. You can find all other details from your lawyer. If you need to contact me for any reason, it will have to be through legal channels. She paused for a moment, taking a deliberate breath before continuing, her voice still cool and detached. I've also arranged a restraining order, effective immediately, because I don't want to have any further contact with you. It's included in the envelope, along with all the other necessary documents. In addition, I've changed my phone number and email address, and all my previous accounts have been closed. I sat there, stunned into silence, unable to process the flood of information. My mind felt paralyzed as I stared blankly at her. The coffee she had poured for me sat untouched on the table, a faint wisp of steam rising and slowly dissipating, its warmth fading just like the life I thought we'd shared. Miranda didn't seem to expect a response, she continued as if delivering a rehearsed script. Please, she said sharply, tapping her manicured nail on the tabletop for emphasis, do not try to create any problems by involving the children. They know what's happening and won't provide you with any information. She met my eyes then, her expression unwavering, and spoke just 2 words, Sandy Thompson. Her gaze lingered for a moment, as though to ensure her message had sunk in. Then, without another word, she rose from her seat, crossed the threshold, and walked out the door. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed through the silence, followed by the muffled slam of the car door and the growl of the engine as it roared to life. I sat frozen, listening as the car's noise faded into the distance until only stillness remained. That was the last time I saw or spoke to Miranda for the next 16 months. I was a late and only child, born when my parents were nearing 40. For years, they believed they might never have children, so my arrival was nothing short of a miracle in their eyes. They cherished me deeply, their gratitude toward life and heaven reflected in every small act of care and devotion. As I grew older, I took on the responsibility of building a stable career. Through perseverance and long hours, I began closing successful deals that nearly doubled my initial salary. But this came at a cost. 12-hour workdays, late nights, and even weekends became the norm. I was determined to provide for my family, no matter the personal toll. Mary, my wife, shared in this effort. In the months leading up to giving birth, she took on a part-time job as a secretary while simultaneously pursuing an online degree. It was a delicate balance, but her parents stepped in, offering vital support during those hectic times. Then came the trip that changed everything. 2 days before I was scheduled to leave for an important ceremony, disaster struck. Our son Luke was diagnosed with whooping cough, and the very next day, Kelly fell ill too. I had no choice but to attend the event, my presence was mandatory. Mary, with sadness in her eyes, kissed me goodbye on Friday morning and asked me to promise I would try to enjoy the days ahead. When I arrived at the venue, I checked in and informed the organizers that I'd be attending the gala without a +1. Everything after that turned into a blur. The next thing I remembered was waking up at 5 a.m. the following morning in a panic. I was lying in bed, and next to me, completely uncovered, was Sandy Thompson. My heart raced, my ears rang, and the severity of my hangover only made things worse. Terrified and ashamed, I scrambled out of bed on shaky legs, frantically gathered my belongings, and checked out within 20 minutes. The 4.5-hour drive home was a haze of anxiety and regret. I had no idea how I was going to explain my sudden return to Mary, let alone process what had just happened. When I finally arrived, Mary was understandably surprised to see me so soon. Her joy at my return quickly gave way to suspicion and concern. As I stood there, my guilt weighing heavier than my exhaustion, I realized this was the moment I'd feared most. When I confessed to Mary that I had gotten drunk at the gala dinner and had a regrettable one-night encounter, I spared no detail. I described it as nothing more than 90 minutes of cold, mechanical physicality, a mistake that I could never justify or fully erase. The aftermath of that night left a deep scar in our relationship. It took months for intimacy to return between us, but over time, it did. At Mary's request, we never spoke of the incident again, silently agreeing to bury it in the past. The following year brought a mix of hope and change. Mary graduated with her business degree and began searching for a job where she could apply her new skills. Meanwhile, our friendship with Dan and Lisa Roberts flourished. We spent nearly every weekend together, except when work obligations for Dan or me got in the way. Those were some of the happiest times, but the joy didn't last. Tragedy struck unexpectedly when Lisa passed away. It was devastating for all of us, but it was Dan who bore the brunt of the loss. He was shattered by the shock and grief, and caring for their 11-year-old daughter alone proved too overwhelming. To help, Mary began visiting the Roberts house after work 3 times a week. She cleaned, ensured everything was in order, and prepared dinners that Dan and his daughter could easily reheat. At least, that's how Mary presented her involvement to me. As time passed, significant changes continued to reshape my life. The house I once called home was sold, stripped of nearly all its furnishings. We sold the dining table, kitchen appliances, and a bedroom set to the new owners. Most of the remaining furniture and household items were sold to neighbors and acquaintances in the days leading up to the sale. What little was left was either taken to a landfill or donated. A former colleague's son had promised to help with the final cleanup, ensuring everything was ready for the new residents. Even the last traces of our shared life were being dismantled. Mary's efficiency in severing ties was remarkable. She had ruthlessly and decisively cut every loose end between us. I couldn't help but recall her earlier frustration when she learned I had sent registered letters to the children to notify them of my move. "Why didn't you just call them and tell them you were moving?" she had asked, her voice tinged with visible annoyance. I explained that it was the only way to ensure they received the news. If I hadn't done it that way, I feared they might never have been properly informed. A few days later, Mary made a call to our daughter Kelly. I could hear their conversation clearly from where I stood. "Hello, Mom. How are you?" Kelly's cheerful voice rang out. "I'm fine, honey. What are you up to right now?" Mary asked casually. "Well, right now, we're hanging out with Cassie," Kelly replied with a light-hearted giggle. "We're planning to go to a party later, so we're just lying around and saving our energy." Mary's expression tightened slightly as she continued. "Have you heard anything from your father lately?" she asked, her gaze flicking toward me as her eyebrow arched meaningfully. "Yeah, I talked to him last night," Kelly responded. "He mentioned that he'd spoken to you and that he'd pick Cassie up soon." Mary's tone turned sharper. "When was the last time you talked to him?" Kelly hesitated, sensing the shift in her mother's voice. "Oh, I'm not sure, Mom. Maybe a few weeks ago." The amusement in her tone quickly faded as she picked up on the unease in Mary's voice. The conversation trailed off, leaving an air of tension lingering in the room. I unlocked my phone and handed it to Mary, showing her the call log for Kelly's number. A glance at the screen made it clear, numerous attempts to reach my daughter, all unanswered. "To be honest," I said, my voice heavy with resignation, "none of the kids have called me since you left. Not once in almost a year and a half." Mary raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "That's funny to hear," she replied, her voice edged with bitterness. "I was just sitting next to her the other day. Kelly's happy that she'll be getting a new dad soon." Her words cut deep, but I managed to steady myself. "You know that old saying, out of sight, out of mind. Well, it seems I'm already a forgotten figure to Kelly. To her, I'm nothing more than an empty space. I pointed back to my phone. As you can see, I've made every effort, but I've been completely shut out. And as far as I know, in 3 weeks, I'll be officially replaced by the real dad. I could see the sting of my words reflected in Mary's face, her expression momentarily crumbling. It's the truth, I added, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. Since you left, I've only spoken to both of them once. Mary's eyes welled with tears, glistening as she tried to process what I'd said. Despite everything, I knew she still loved my parents, especially my mom. Mom's condition has worsened, I said, my voice softening. She's in the late stages of Alzheimer's now. She doesn't remember anything most of the time, 90% of her days are spent in confusion. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. And Dad? She asked, her voice trembling. I looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Dad passed away a little over 3 weeks ago. The hospital said it was a heart attack, but honestly, I think it was something else. My voice broke for a moment, and I had to take a breath before continuing. I think his heart gave out because he couldn't bear the pain. He was suffering too much, from disappointment and grief. At this, Mary burst into tears, her sobs breaking through the fragile silence between us. How? How did it happen? She choked out. It's not something I've talked about much, I admitted, brushing away my own tears with the back of my hand. I never even told my parents about the divorce. I kept telling myself I'd do it, sooner or later, but when it came time to face them, I just couldn't. I took another deep breath, the weight of my confession settling heavily in the room. When you left, I went to visit them the following weekend. I wanted to explain everything in person. But when I got there, I realized just how much worse things had gotten for Mom. Dad had mentioned her forgetfulness before, but this was on another level entirely. I paused, the memories flooding back painfully. She barely recognized me. Her face was pale, her hands trembling. And Dad, he looked so tired, so worn down from it all. He tried to keep it together for her, but I could see the cracks in his strength. The room fell silent again, save for Mary's quiet sobs. We both sat there, bound by the shared grief of what had been lost, not just in our marriage, but in the lives we had built around us. I found Dad in his favorite chair, I continued my somber story, my voice dull with exhaustion. He was sitting back, clutching our family photograph in his hands. You know the one, the sunny day when all 4 of us were laughing and goofing around together. My voice wavered as I added, the photo was still damp from his tears. I paused, the weight of the memory pressing down on me. So, yes, Mary, our divorce broke his heart. You know how much he valued family. Mom and Dad were married for 52 years. He was a man of the old school, and of course, he believed you and I would stay together for life. He couldn't understand why we didn't. Mary was sobbing openly now, her body shaking with emotion. But I felt empty, there were no tears left for me to cry. Over the past weeks, I'd been completely drained, emotionally shattered. My eyes wandered around the room, landing on the mantelpiece. Sitting there, stark against the emptiness, was a single greeting card. Mary's tear-streaked face followed my gaze, and her expression shifted as she noticed the card. Without looking at her, I continued in the same detached, distant tone. You know, I began, my words cold and lifeless, it's funny how some things remain untouched, even when everything else falls apart. Mary abruptly stood, her face flushing with indignation. She pointed at me accusingly, her voice trembling with anger. Don't you dare. Don't you dare turn this all on me. Her outburst caught me off guard. For a moment, I stared at her, then, to her obvious shock, I began to laugh. Not just a chuckle, but deep, uncontrollable laughter that shook my entire body and brought tears to my eyes. It wasn't joy, it was the kind of laughter born from sheer disbelief and irony. Oh, of course. I managed between gasps, clutching my sides. Let's not forget about Sandy Thompson. The reason you spent 15+ years planning your perfect revenge, right? Mary stood frozen, clearly stunned by my reaction. I wiped my eyes, my laughter fading into a cold, steady voice. Yes, I remember that evening perfectly, I said, sarcasm dripping from my words. And of course, I expect you to believe me. Why wouldn't you? After all, I've never lied to you before, and I especially have no reason to lie to you now that everything between us has been over for so long. My tone softened, regaining composure. But believe what you want, Mary. It doesn't matter anymore. The room fell silent, save for the sound of her uneven breathing. We stood there, locked in the shared ruins of our once close lives, both of us knowing that no words could undo what had been done. I don't care, talk about whatever you want, Mary scoffed, her tone casual and dismissive. It was unnervingly indifferent, more like something Kelly would say than the thoughtful, composed woman I once knew. Her apathy stirred something in me, a sharp anger that burned in my chest. Despite her attitude, I couldn't shake the feeling that she cared more than she was letting on. Shaking off my irritation, I turned my attention back to the phone conversation at hand. Yes, she still works with us in the same branch in Little Rock. Do you need her number, or should I connect you directly? The voice on the other end asked helpfully. Thank you so much for your help, I replied, managing a polite tone. Please transfer my call to her line. And Jane, take care of yourself, okay? If Paul decides to make an honest woman out of you, I'll be waiting for an invitation. Jane giggled warmly. Absolutely, Alan. And don't forget about us either, okay? I'm transferring you now, take care. As I waited for the call to connect, I noticed Mary's expression shift subtly. She seemed caught off guard by the casual warmth of my exchange. Her eyes darted toward me, but her lips remained pursed in a hostile, twisted frown. Then Sandy's voice came through the line, vibrant and familiar. Alan, is that really you? It's been ages, she exclaimed, her excitement infectious. Yes, it's me, I chuckled. It's been a while, hasn't it? How are you? The conversation flowed effortlessly, her voice brimming with nostalgia. Do you remember how we first met? She asked, her tone light and teasing. Of course, I said, laughing softly. It was 17 years ago, though, if I'm honest, apart from the award ceremony, I don't remember much else from that night. Oh, Alan, she replied, her amusement clear even through the phone. You were so funny that evening. There was a warmth in her voice as she added, what do you even remember? Well, I began, chuckling, I remember giving my clumsy thank you speech and then leaving the stage. After that, it's mostly a blur, but I think there were a few drinks involved. Sandy laughed heartily. Oh, there were more than a few, I assure you. And then there was that moment on the dance floor. Her voice took on a mischievous tone, and I could hear the smile in her words. Mary, who had been listening from across the room, crossed her arms tightly over her chest. Her lips twisted into a sour grin, her expression hardening as Sandy continued. And, Sandy added playfully, when I dragged you onto the dance floor, I accidentally slid my hand down and felt, well, let's just say, I could tell you were having a good time. She laughed, her voice light and teasing. I could feel the temperature rise in the room, both from Sandy's flirtatious banter and Mary's growing hostility. Ah, it's getting a little warm in here, I said, trying to diffuse the tension with humor. Sandy let out another laugh. Oh, Alan, you always knew how to make me laugh. Mary's demeanor shifted once more, her face stiffening as she turned away from me. The silence in the room was deafening, save for the slight rustling coming through the phone. After a few seconds, Sandy's voice returned, softer now. Sorry about that, I took a sip of water. All these memories got me a little flustered. I smiled despite the tension. Where were we? Oh, yes, Sandy replied with a laugh. We were talking about how you ended up in my room that night. I was ready to get a little naughty, Sandy admitted, her voice carrying a mix of embarrassment and laughter. I've already told you it was accidental, and it was only that one weekend, no matter how much you might have asked me otherwise. Honestly, Alan, your wife must be a very lucky woman. Her words landed like a thunderclap in the room. Mary's eyes widened in shock, and she instinctively covered her mouth with both hands. The weight of what she had done, of all the lies and schemes, seemed to hit her in that moment, and it struck her hard. I, however, felt no sympathy for her at all. Not then. Not after everything. The disaster of our marriage was entirely rooted in her arrogance and hasty, self-serving actions. Years of calculated scheming had been aimed solely at controlling outcomes and painting herself as blameless. Her reaction now only puzzled me further. What was she truly grappling with? Sandy's voice broke through my thoughts. By the way, she added with a light-hearted laugh, it's actually because of Rob that I thought of you, buddy. Isn't that a bit strange? Rob? I asked, confused. Yeah, she continued, amused. His older brother, Dan, is getting married in a couple of weeks. His fiancée's name is Andy, and, get this, her last name is Dowd, just like yours. It made me wonder if she might be a relative of yours since you're the only Dowd I know. Mary's reaction now made sense. The mention of Dan's name had clearly stirred something in her. Still, I kept my tone even. No, I can't say that Andy is a relative. Among my extended family, there's no one by that name, I said thoughtfully. Sandy laughed. Well, it's just one of those funny coincidences. Rob once mentioned that Dan and Andy had been in an on-and-off relationship for over 13 years. Can you imagine that? Her casual remark sent a chill through me, but it told me more than she realized. If Dan had been so close to Andy for that long, it was proof that Mary's parents must have known everything that had been going on between Mary and Dan. They'd likely supported her all along, covering for her whenever I tried to reach her. When Mary was away, I'd often call her parents, only to be met with excuses, she was busy, out running errands, or resting. Not long after, Mary would call me back, her voice full of fabricated reassurances. As I sat there, my thoughts spiraled into the past. Sandy's laugh and her casual mention of relationships resurfaced a bitter truth I'd learned before. You know, she added lightly, my neighbor's husband had something similar with a woman he worked with. Can you imagine that kind of relationship? Oh, I could imagine it all too well. The web of lies, the hidden truths, and the echoes of betrayal weren't foreign to me at all. They were the foundation of what had once been my marriage, a structure now long since crumbled. I mumbled something, my voice trailing off as I tried to meet Miranda's eyes. But her gaze was stubbornly evasive, darting everywhere but toward me. Her cheeks, neck, and even part of her chest flushed with a vivid brightness that would have made a ripe beet envious. Her breath came in shallow, uneven bursts, betraying her discomfort. As I sat there, still grappling with the undercurrent of emotions, Sandy's words replayed in my head. I made sure to make it clear to Rob, she had said with a wry chuckle, that I wouldn't hesitate to throw him under the bus if he ever dared pull something like that. But honestly, I don't think they would have gotten married at all if his bosses hadn't directly ordered him to make Andy an honest woman. You know, after her ex-husband sued the company when she divorced him. The story was almost too wild to believe. Can you imagine, Alan? Her ex, her so-called house husband, wasn't willing to put up with all the chaos. He had a completely different perspective on their relationship, and honestly, good for him. There are still decent men out there. Sandy's voice carried a hint of approval as she added, Rob confided that the company had to shell out a significant amount of money to hush the whole thing up. Messy, right? Meanwhile, my own life had taken a different, quieter turn. On the recommendation of my former company, I'd started applying for a position at a branch of an insurance company near my mother's house. It wasn't in sales, which had been my bread and butter for years. Instead, they wanted me to investigate suspicious insurance claims. It was a completely new area for me, but the challenge intrigued me. The pay wouldn't match what I used to earn, but it would more than cover my needs. The job came with another perk: proximity. It was located only an hour's drive from my mother's home, assuming I didn't need to stop along the way. That made it the perfect balance, close enough to be there when she needed me, but far enough for me to have some independence. Standing by the door later that day, I gestured toward a pile of boxes stacked neatly in the corridor by the entrance. "All of this is yours," I said, my tone steady but distant. "Clothes, photographs, and other odds and ends you left behind." My hand swept toward the packages as if to say, "This chapter is over." Miranda said nothing, her face a mix of emotions I couldn't quite read. For a moment, the only sounds were the faint hum of the street outside and the subtle tension lingering between us. "I was planning to send the boxes to you next week," I said evenly, my voice calm and composed, a testament to the unwavering politeness my parents had instilled in me. "But since you're here, I can load them into your car if you'd like." It wasn't an offer made out of affection, but more from a lingering sense of courtesy that refused to die. The boxes were all that remained of what once was a collection of her belongings, clothes, photographs, and trinkets that no longer had a place in my life. They had been gathering dust near the door, packed with care by my former colleagues as a final gesture of kindness. Their thoughtfulness and warmth were a comfort, something I would carry with me into my new chapter, even as everything else crumbled. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill the space between us one last time. "Well, Mary," I said finally, "this is it. It's all over now. Take care of yourself." Her lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. I didn't linger. "Goodbye," I added, my voice steady but resolute. "I hope we never see each other again." As I turned and walked away, I paused at the doorway, glancing back one final time. There she stood, the woman I had once loved with every fiber of my being, now a distant figure in my life. Her shoulders were hunched slightly, her gaze cast downward. It was the last image of her that would remain etched in my memory, a bittersweet reminder of what was, and what would never be again. Without another word, I stepped out into the world beyond, ready to leave the past behind.